Hey y'all, how's it going? Welcome back to What Bert Grows, and today we are talking about roses for beginners. So while I make this cup of tea, I'm going to tell you kind of how I got into roses and how we ended up here. And then later in the video, we're going to talk about how to choose a good spot for roses, how to pick a rose, all the different types of roses. So if you are a beginner and you're looking to get into roses, this is going to be the video for you. So how I got into roses? Well, it turns out it's actually in my blood. And what I mean by that is my great-grandfather actually was an avid rose grower, which I didn't know. So I'll kind of catch you up really quick, but basically how this happened was I have all these blackberries along my back fence. I have about 7 or 8 blackberry bushes, and my idea was to have the whole back fence be all these big, beautiful blackberry bushes. And I needed something to go in between them because as much as I love the blackberry bushes, I wanted like those really nice pops of color. And so I had planted some annuals and was thinking, well, maybe I'll just plant this part of the garden every year. And then I decided that that's just a lot of work, and that there's so much else about the garden that changes, especially the veggie beds, that I really would like to have something that's a little more permanent, if you will. So I started looking at good companion plants for blackberries, and roses were one of the first things that came up. So thank you, Epic Gardening, for your lovely rose companion plant video, or blackberry companion plant video, because that's what really helped me settle on roses. And so I went and got my first rose. It's a gold medal rose that I've had since last spring, and it's done really well. I will admit it's not in the best place for a rose, which we'll talk about. We'll go out there and look at it together when we talk about kind of how to pick a spot for a rose, but it's doing pretty well, I will say. So I go get this rose and I'm telling my mom and my grandma about it, and they had just started. I had always heard that my great-grandfather Alfred was a really amazing rose grower, but what I didn't know is that he actually purchased a rose for every year that his wife was alive. So he had like 83, 84 rose bushes, which is just genuinely so wild to me to think that number one, that's romantic. Things like that just don't happen anymore. And number two, that's so many rose bushes. And then I started getting all these pictures. I started going through my grandfather's things after he passed away, and I started getting all these beautiful pictures of Alfred, and not only his rose garden, but his veggie garden and his citrus trees. And it just made me feel really, really connected to not only him, but kind of like this part of my heritage. So that kind of got me into the summer. And then I thought to myself, I said, okay, what if I could match these roses that I have all these beautiful pictures of? Like, what if I was able to do that? So that's when I just started doing some Googling, some good old-fashioned Googling, and I reached out to a company called Heirloom Roses. Didn't know the company at the time, didn't know anything about them. All I knew is that I was trying to find people who really knew and understood roses and could help me match these old photos with actual plants that I could put in the ground. Well, I sent Heirloom Roses a message via their customer service, which I wasn't even a customer at this point, but I basically just sent them these pictures and I said, hey, is there any way you guys can help me identify these roses that I have pictures of? And by gosh, they asked me all these questions about fragrance and color and how they grew, and if they were bushy or if they had long stems or if they climbed. And I was so overwhelmed because I just didn't know that roses could be this detailed. And I got all the answers, and I ended up purchasing 4 rose bushes from them that got here in the fall. And so I planted those, and we'll see where those are outside here in a little bit. And I made a Instagram reel about the whole experience, and I shared it on my Instagram just on kind of a whim. And sure enough, Heirloom Roses reached out, and they had been looking for brand ambassadors specifically in Texas. And so I interviewed to be a brand ambassador with them, and I'm really proud to work with them. So I would be remiss to go through any more of this video without telling you that I do have a discount code. It's an affiliate code with Heirloom Roses for 20% off. I'm gonna put the affiliate link down in the description, and I will make sure to put the code down there as well as the codes up here. So if by the end of this video, or maybe right now, you want to buy some roses, I would love if you used that affiliate code to let them know that I was the one that sent you. So that's kind of the skinny on that. I have learned so much about roses since I've been working with them. The company is quite wonderful, if you ask me, and they're really, really committed to roses and the rose communities, because let me tell you, the rose communities be running as deep as the roots, okay? And it's really, really cool, and it's very eye-opening. So that is how we ended up here, friends and family, is because of Alfred, and then just this really beautifully organic journey that has happened over the last few months. So if you are a beginner in roses, if you are a seasoned gardener but don't really know that much about roses, my whole goal is for us to do this together. I am getting 10 rose bushes on March 1st. It is currently the end of January, and so we're doing this together. I barely know what I'm doing. I have kept one rose bush alive for, you know, almost a year. I've kept 4 of them alive for like maybe 6 months. So I'm doing something right, okay? But I'm calling this whole series Becoming a Rosarian. So if you're seeing this right now in January, you're gonna see this in parts. But what is going to happen over the next year is I'm going to go through this journey with you, and then at the end of the year, put this in one big long video for all of the people who are super hesitant about roses to be able to watch and enjoy in its entirety. So I officially have my cup of tea. It has been so cold here that I am deeply sick of being inside. So let's go see some plants. Okay, so before we actually go see any plants, I would be totally remiss not to kind of give you at least a little bit of a warning. There is a small risk of growing roses in certain parts of the country, and it's called rosette disease. And would this tell me to stop planting roses or to not do it? No. Is it something you should be aware of? 100%. So if you go to roserosette.org, you can actually see the areas that are heavily impacted by rosette disease. Does this mean you're gonna get it? No. Does this mean your area has it? Yes. So even if I go to my county, I'm in Central Texas, even if I go to my county, there are like 1 or 2 reported instances of rosette disease. So what this is it's actually a virus that is spread by these little mites that get blown throughout the wind. So because these mites are kind of blown throughout the wind, they're microscopic, then this virus attacks your plants. I'm gonna throw up a couple of pictures of what it looks like. As a beginner, this is not something that I think should deter you from growing roses. I think you should still give it a shot. There's lots of things you can do to try and prevent rosette disease. Unfortunately, if your roses do get hit with rosette disease, the only solution is to get rid of the plant. So it doesn't live in the soil, but because rose roots are so prolific and so deep and very much in the soil, you could potentially leave roots of the roses when you pull them out, and then your new plant, if you put another rose right there, would potentially be impacted. So it's not recommended to replant roses in the same spot where you've had rosette, but again, it's just something to be aware of. There is a few things that you can do to try and prevent it from happening. One of those things is to plant your roses close to a fence or a wall, basically to prevent any like windbreak going on. Another thing is just to have really healthy plant practices like cleaning your shears, and another thing is making sure you're deadheading the roses. A lot of these little mites will live in the petals, and so if you're cutting off those heads as they kind of die back, that's another really good way to prevent rosette disease. Also, just having healthy plants. I kind of hate that advice in the garden, like in the veggie garden, but it does ring somewhat true. Healthy plants are a lot more disease resistant. The other thing about this little tiny mite that spreads rosette virus is that it can't actually fly. it can only crawl. And that's why it gets mainly passed through the wind. So another thing is you want to allow lots of space between your roses, and you also don't want them necessarily touching other roses if your area is impacted by rose rosette. So that's something I'm trying to be really mindful of, and I'll kind of show you some of the modifications we've made to try our best to prevent this, but also making sure that your roses are virus free. So all the heirloom roses that I get are both own root roses, which we'll talk about what that means later, and they're also virus free roses. So that's my big scary, it's not even that scary, kind of like, hey, this could happen to you, but also at the same time, I personally don't think it should stop you from planting roses. Okay, so I know it doesn't look like much right at this very second, but these are where some of my existing rose bushes are planted. So roses like a lot of sun, most roses. Don't click away from this video if you don't have a fully 8 hours of sunspot, stick with me. But they like a lot of sun and they like well draining soil. So these are a really good spot for them. We do live on a slight slope, so that's why the one rose I'm going to show you isn't the best. Roses don't like to have what are called wet feet. So roses don't like to have really, really wet roots that stay wet. They like to have really good drainage. So that's why a spot like this is really good. Our house faces south, and so we get direct sun east to west all year long. So these get super duper full sun, but I told you not to click away because there are some roses that do well in partial shade. So this is really tough to see on camera because of the shadows, but one of the places that I'm going to be growing a partial shade climbing rose is up that wall. So we have our 2 compost bins and then our shed. This is kind of more of a utilitarian area of our garden that I would like to be a little prettier. So that's why we are doing a partial shade climbing rose up here. Now, surprisingly, another ideal spot for a rose is actually in a pot. So there are specific types of roses that are really, really container friendly, and I'm going to be getting a couple of those too. So we have one partial shade climbing rose coming, one for a pot in full sun, and then actually one for a pot in partial shade. So really, when it comes to roses, you can basically grow them anywhere except for right under a tree where it has full shade and the tree is sucking up all of the moisture out of the ground. So really there's a rose for everybody in every situation, unless you like live in the middle of a jungle where all you have is shade. Here is my gold medal climbing rose. The flowers are looking a little sad because we just had a few nights of a freeze. Hi Lana, what are you doing? Would you like to come say hi? No, okay. So we just had a little bit of a freeze, but this rose, when I planted it, was pretty small, just like the other ones you saw. And now it's kind of almost up to my hip, and this will be its 2nd year. So the first year with roses, you typically see them really, really focusing on their roots. And then the 2nd year is when they really start to grow. And then the 3rd year is when they really start to put on prolific blooms. Now, this isn't necessarily the best spot in my yard for roses because it is kind of at the bottom of that hill that I talked about. So when it does rain here in Texas, this part of the yard, this whole area stays pretty wet. So I have seen it struggle. It has gotten black spot before that I've had to treat. So I'm kind of on the fence. She might get moved. She might not. I don't know. We'll see. So now that we've talked about the ideal place to plant roses, any risks that could potentially be associated, let's actually talk about the different types of roses, which is weirdly an exciting conversation. Okay, so first and foremost, there are 2 different types of roses that you can buy at the store. You have own root roses and grafted roses. Now, own root roses are exactly what they sound like. They have their own roots. So the way that own root roses are typically made, so they will actually propagate those roses. So what they'll do is they will cut some off of the mother plant, they will root those, get them to get roots in the ground, and then they will grow those plants up, and that is what you will buy, is an own root rose. It's basically like a clone from the mother plant. Now, grafted roses are roses that are grafted onto a grafting point. So anything that's grafted is when you're gonna have a rootstock that maybe it's disease resistant, maybe it's cold hardy, and then the top of the plant is a totally different plant from the bottom of the plant. So what they do is they will typically cut a T into the bottom of the plant, and then they will stick the top plant into the rootstock, and then those two plants will fuse together at the grafting point, and that's how you will get a grafted rose. So you're probably thinking to yourself, what's the difference? Why does it matter? Grafted roses, because of the fact that they have been grafted, have a natural weak point where things like extreme temperatures, disease, all of that can get into that weak point. The other thing with grafted roses is and same thing happens with my grafted citrus trees that are cold hardy. They take a rootstock of a plant that's cold hardy, they grow a different one on top. You can actually get suckers from the rootstock. So on my citrus trees, I'll have these little suckers that grow off that I have to trim off, which isn't a big deal. With roses, it's a little harder to tell the difference between the rootstock cane and the cane that you actually want. So because here in Central Texas, we have really extreme temperature fluctuations, which can make a weak point in the grafting already difficult. And then we do have the potential for rose rosette, and we do have the potential for black spot because it's very humid. I wanted as much disease resistance as possible, so my choice was own root roses. Now the drawback for own root roses, and if you're thinking to yourself, well then why isn't every rose an own root rose? That's a great question. So grafted roses will typically grow faster, which is what people like. People generally, when they buy plants, they like it when they grow really fast. It's really satisfying. Grafted roses typically only last about 15 years. And these are statistics I found on the internet. So just understand that. But grafted roses do not have the longevity that own root roses do because of those points of weakness. So that's something important for you to understand as you're looking at roses, is own root roses versus grafted roses. Own root roses will typically take a little bit longer to get their feet in the ground, grow up big and tall, and then you really don't end up with those super showy blossoms until like year 3. That's what they tell people. I will say one of those plants I bought literally maybe in like September of last year, so it's been less than 6 months that plant's been in the ground. It gave me the most beautiful apricot rose blossoms like within weeks of planting it. So while that is a general rule of thumb for, you know, until these plants get really big and bushy and beautiful, your plants will still give you blossoms. It's not just going to be these like thorny canes growing out of the ground. So that's the difference between own root roses and grafted roses. Each kind of have their perk. Own root roses don't have a weakness that I know of other than the fact that they're just a little bit slower to grow. But when you're talking about perennials, we're really talking about having these plants in the ground long term. I would personally rather have a really healthy plant that's going to be there for a really long time and invest in the health of that plant up front, rather than invest in a cheaper plant that I'm having to fight all the time because it's not doing well, it's disease resistant, and I'm just gonna have to buy a new one in a few years when ultimately we get a super, super hot spell, or we get a crazy freeze because that happens to us, or I end up with some kind of disease that I can't get managed. Okay, so now let's go over types of roses, and I'll be really honest with you, I do have my notes because there's a lot of different types of roses, y'all. So I don't want you to get overwhelmed by this section. I think it's really informative, but at the same time, after I go through all of this, I'm gonna tell you how I think you should go about picking roses, but this is really interesting to learn about. The first one are hybrid tea roses. They're easily the most recognizable rose. They have pointed buds, super long stems. These are gonna be the types of roses that when you look at it, you're like, that's a rose. So these types of roses will bloom continually because, fun fact, there are roses that only bloom once a year. So they will bloom continually, and generally when they grow, they're very like narrow and upright. So they're really, really good for cutting gardens. So if you're kind of creating like a cottage, like flower cutting garden, they're really, really good for that type of garden, or they're really good in mass planting. So if you want like a big swag of roses, hybrid tea roses are also really, really great for that. The next classification of rose are mostly ones that I have, and they're called floribundas. Every time I say it, I think of like cowabunga. Like, cowabunga, dude. Yeah, okay. So floribundas are known for being very prolific bloomers, and floribundas are actually a breeding between the hybrid tea that we just talked about and polyanthas. So this is a combination of both of those two. So the polyantha is what gives it these bigger, more kind of like luscious blooms, and the hybrid tea is what gives it the color range. So floribundas you can get in a ton of different colors, different shades of different colors. I mean, it's honestly, it'll blow your mind. You can spend hours going through different rose colors and it will blow your mind. The other thing about floribundas is they're known for being very, very fragrant, which I am personally very excited about. I love a good like garden smell. The smell of marigolds in the summer just like brings me an immense amount of joy. So floribundas are also really, really good for cutting gardens where you're gonna wanna be cutting flowers out of them. Now the next type of rose is called a grandiflora, and a grandiflora is a combination, again, are you noticing a trend, of a hybrid tea and a floribunda. So they have even bigger flowers than a floribunda. They're known for having like these really, really high petaled flowers. The only difference, for me it's a drawback, for other people it doesn't matter, is they're also known for the bottoms of the plants being kind of bare. So they have longer canes, which are great for cutting, but then the bottoms of the plants are kind of bare looking. And honestly, when I look at my great-grandpa Alfred's rose garden, that's kind of what they look like. I really wonder explicitly what varieties he had. He probably had a bunch of different ones. And from talking to my mom and grandma, they said he probably would have just gone to the plant store and bought whatever they had. Like he wasn't really into all the different stuff about roses. But that would be a drawback for me personally on the grandifloras, is their bottoms being a little bit bare. But if that doesn't bother you, grandifloras are a great option. Also a really, really good option for mass plantings, because you're gonna have those bottoms that are a little more bare, but then you'll have the tops that are really beautiful and prolific, and they've got these big, massively cupped flowers. So they're really, really good for mass plantings if you're looking for an area for that. And now we switch gears a little bit into old garden roses. So I actually saw an old garden rose when I was in Scotland on my honeymoon called the Jacobite rose. And old garden roses are any kind of rose that was before the hybrid tea, which I believe was in 1867. So the old garden roses typically only bloom once. And this was the case with the Jacobite rose. There's a specific like list of kind of plant specific names. The Jacobite rose was an Alba Maximus something. I'll find it, it'll be fine. But they are ones that have this really like wild growth habit. They can, and I just think about the Jacobite rose. Those are old garden roses. That crazy Jacobite rose supposedly had been documented as early as the 1700s. And I'm not saying like that species of rose, I'm saying like that plant specifically had supposedly been there since the 1700s. Wild. It's not that I don't believe it. I did actually ask the Airbnb owner, her name was Sarah, I was like, are you sure about that? And she said, well, it's at least been there since I was a child, and I believe she was in her 70s. So still a 70-year-old rose, massive. The trunk on this thing was huge. Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if it was 300 years old. That's an old garden rose. So the next type of rose, and a really good kind of thing to understand in your vocabulary about roses, are climbing roses. So climbing roses, I think coming from the gardening world, we think of climbing plants as having like these little tendrils that grab onto things. It's not really how a climbing rose works. So climbing roses are really aggressive growers. They end up having super long canes that need support, so you have to have some kind of trellis, which I'm excited to show you all the different trellising things we're doing this year with our climbing roses. We're trying quite a few different varieties or types of trellising for our climbing roses. The canes are often really thorny, but they put off like really big, beautiful blooms that like have those beautiful archways and walls, and those are your climbing roses. They make a really big, beautiful impact, which I'm honestly so stoked about. So the next type of rose are English roses, and this is where your David Austin roses are going to come into play. So David Austin is a rose breeder, because that's another big thing in the rose world, is breeders of roses. So that's what your David Austins are going to be. They're really like romantic. They're known for being really like sweet. They have a really high petal count, so they're going to be like big and luscious, and their heads can kind of like droop over. So they're known for being kind of like that classic garden rose, especially the David Austin rose people who like swear by David Austin roses. They are a dedicated group of individuals. I mean, you can't have them describe a rose bush without telling you it is a David Austin rose. And that's not me. There's no hate. It's just a thing. I don't know why. Next are your polyanthas, which we talked about when we talked about floribundas, because floribundas are polyantha plus hybrid tea. So with polyanthas, one of the things that's really desirable about them is they have these like large clusters of blooms. The only thing is some of those polyantha roses will only bloom once or twice a year. So if you want a polyantha rose, you want to make sure you check their bloom habit. The next type of rose is a hybrid musk. These are continual bloomers, but they only really come in shades of like pale pink, cream, and white. Now the next type of rose we need to talk about are ramblers. Now ramblers are a really interesting type of rose, and I was actually watching the most recent season of Florette on Magnolia Network, and she has a whole episode talking about like old world roses and ramblers, and they're these really like wild and free kind of rose bushes that typically only bloom once a year, but when they do bloom, they put on quite the show. So they're super vigorous growers. They have really long flexible canes, which kind of makes them like form this thicket almost in a way, and they need a big spot. They need a lot of room, and they need to have the right spot so that they can just be kind of wild and free. So if you have a larger property, ramblers might be right up your alley, or if you don't necessarily have kids or dogs, that might be a really good option for you. I will say ramblers are kind of coming back into trend in the rose world, and there's a lot of efforts to save the ramblers because they are kind of a breed of rose that is subject to kind of that like trend in and out, kind of like all plants are, right? It's a thing, it happens. But the ramblers, there's like this really dedicated movement in the rose world about getting people educated about them and getting people to grow ramblers again. Now, am I going to be able to grow a rambler in my backyard with 3 dogs in a suburban backyard with not that much space? No. But if you have more space, I would really encourage you to look at ramblers, because they are a very beautiful plant, and I think something that only blooms like once a year becomes a very special thing. I think it becomes like a mark in the year of like, okay, it's officially spring. The rambler is blooming again. So I do think they're really cool plants. I love the idea of it. It's just I don't have the space for it. If I did, game over. Okay, so the next type of rose is a shrub rose. These are probably ones that you're pretty used to seeing in landscapes. They're really good for beginners. They're very disease resistant. They're easy to grow, and they don't require a ton of maintenance. So if you are somebody who's interested in roses but not ready to like go, you know, face first into like a floribunda or a hybrid tea, maybe you start with a shrub rose and see where that gets you. Also, if you're looking to kind of work them into like a front landscaping, me and my sister have been talking about her front landscaping, and we are thinking about doing some like interspersed hydrangeas and roses, and a couple of the ones that she liked were shrub roses. So kind of just like how it sounds, a shrub rose is a really good choice for a kind of landscape situation, or if you just like shrub roses, that's cool too. Okay, and then the last variety is called rugosa. Now these are extremely vigorous growers. They can even be considered invasive, and they are a very large shrub-like rose. Very thorny, however they're extremely hardy. They take well to really extreme conditions, but also really extreme soils. So they're known to be able to deal with sandy soil, hardy soil, salty soil, really heavy clay soils. So they're very hardy plants, and they also only bloom once a year. So now that we've talked about all the different types of roses and I have sufficiently terrified you, let's talk about how I think you should pick roses, and let's talk about how I went through the process of picking roses. So the Heirloom Roses website has a ton of great filters for you to kind of make this overwhelming experience like a lot easier. I went on the Heirloom Roses website and I first selected my zone. So I'm in growing zone 9. I am in 9A, Central Texas. If you don't know what your growing zone is, if you're like super duper new to plants, what I want you to do is just go to Google. I want you to type in growing zone, enter your zip code, it will come up, and that's your growing zone. Your growing zone is important because it's going to tell you your first and last frost date. It's going to tell you how many frost days you have. It's very important for picking something like this. So after I picked my zone, what I then went and did is I went over to the left-hand side and I picked either climbing or non-climbing, because you either got something for it to climb on or you don't. There's no in between. Then from there, I also went through and picked some characteristics that I wanted. If you're looking for a container rose, you can find it by clicking the box that says container friendly. If you are looking for a partial shade rose, you can find that filter as well. And that will show you all of your options. And now that you have your options by your zone and what your situation is, and if you want it to climb or not, now's the fun part, because now you can start to look at all the different types of colors. You can start to look at all the different like types of roses. Then you can look at how fragrant they are. Maybe you really want a pink rose, right? So you find a pink rose that works in partial shade, that works in a container, boom, Queen of Sweden. So that I found is the easiest way to be able to pick your roses. Before you do any of that, before you buy a plant, you've got to find a good spot for it based on everything we talked about earlier, which is you either need a spot with full sun in the ground that has good drainage, you need a container that's full sun, you need a partial shade spot in soil with good drainage, or you need a partial shade container. You will be able to find roses for any of those 4 situations, I promise you. Now, the other thing specifically about heirloom roses is that you can actually buy your roses now and have them shipped later. So if you want to purchase them now, if you want to go ahead and lock it in, you can go ahead and buy those and they'll ship them to you when you're actually able to plant them. Which for me is just kind of, I'm like so looking forward to March 1st. I'm so looking forward to for my roses to actually get here and for me to be able to do something with them. Granted, I have a lot of infrastructure work to do between now and then, which don't worry, I will be recording for you guys. Okay, so you've made it to the end of the video where I'm gonna talk about what roses I chose. This Monstera leaf, he just really wants to be part of the party, you know? All right, I have my list, so I am gonna read off my phone, which I try not to do, but for Alfred's matches, what I'm doing in that back section that I showed you is every other is going to be a blackberry and a rose. So the blackberries I have going up some steel fans to keep them kind of away from the rose bushes so that we don't have those plants touching like we talked about earlier. But it'll still be a really nice like visual boom that'll be really, really lovely to look at. So, what I have going on in the back here, the ones that I already have back there are a gold medal rose. I have a Sunbelt South Africa, a Grand Amore, a Bride rose, and then the last one is a Double Delight. And those are all matches from the photos I have from Alfred's Rose Garden. So these next ones are more matches from Alfred's Rose Garden, from the pictures that I have. So this first one is called Jump for Joy. It's a Floribunda rose that has 3 to 4 inch ruffled blooms that are born in clusters on a round bushy shrub. The delicious peachy pink color pairs well with its light apple fragrance. I'll also be getting the Cinco de Mayo rose. Clusters of blooms having a unique color of smoky lavender and rusty red orange, providing a mild sweet apple scent on continual blooming canes. The next one is Ivory Tower. Blooms of light pink to apricot, aging to cream, having a moderate spicy fragrance, born on an upright plant having semi-glossy foliage. The next one is called Proud Land. With a rose like Chrysler Imperial in your background, you can't go wrong. A deep red beauty with a very strong fragrance to match. Large, very double blooms grace this plant all season long. And this last one was a stretch, I'm gonna be really honest, but it was pretty and it was close enough, so I picked it. Called the Pretty in Pink Eden Climber. Pretty in Pink exhibits all the same great qualities of the Eden rose, but it's deep pink in color. It has slightly more petals than Eden and is more fragrant. Pretty in Pink Eden performs well on its own roots and is just as vigorous as something else. I don't know, it just gave me a preview in my notes. but it's pretty. It's actually gonna climb on the fence. So this one and the next one I'm gonna talk about, there's actually some really great instructions on how to get roses to climb on your fence using some cable trellising. So I'm gonna give that a shot and see how it goes. I am really excited because if there's something very weird to know about me, I hate seeing my fence. That's why I have grapes climbing. I like to have big archways because I hate to see the fence. I think it's ugly. I think fences are ugly. I like the fence. I like that it gives me privacy. I like my neighbors, but I don't want to see them. I don't like the way the fence looks. Feels a little prison-y for me. So we're hiding the fence. So those were all of my matches for Alfred's garden. Now, then I decided it would be really fun to do some experiments. So that's what I did. So what I did was I went on the heirloom roses. I went on the heirloom, oh my God. Come on, Brooke. I went on the Heirloom Roses website. Bleh. So this rose is called Bathsheba, which is just really fun to say, but it's also a beautiful rose. It has like this apricot center with like these creamy outside. It's also a climber. So I'm actually gonna have the Pretty in Pink Eden climber on one fence panel, and then we have our gate in the corner of our yard, and then I'm gonna have the other Bathsheba on the other fence panel. So literally as you're walking out this gate, it's like a wall of roses, just like coming into an apex at the gate. I shouldn't be so excited, but I am. Bathsheba. The large blooms of Bathsheba show off with 170 plus petals, forming shallowly cupped apricot roses with a subtle hint of yellow. She has a delicious floral myrrh fragrance with hints of honey and tea. This repeat flowering plant is a short climber that will ascend about a 6-foot wall, fence, or doorway with ease. And we have a 6-foot fence, so that'll be perfect. So this next one I actually let my husband pick, and he picked, it is a climbing lavender crush. So this one was one that we kind of had to change our plans on where it was gonna go, but that's fine because we're actually building a pergola. Not a pergola that we can like sit under. The idea was to have a 4-foot wide, almost like a trellis, and then split my big bed in the back from being a 4x16 foot bed to having 2 4x8s. Because I just think they do better with the drip irrigation, and so I also really wanted to get rid of the metal bed that we have in the corner because I just don't like it. So we instead spaced this out, added 4 feet to the middle, and we're building this beautiful pergola. And I'm gonna have 2 lavender crush roses, and it's like an 8-foot pergola. It's so tall. I'm gonna have these lavender crush roses climbing up, and then once you walk through there, that's where the blackberries and the other roses will be, and it'll feel like this little secret garden. So I'm super, super excited for this, and it was one of those things that me and my husband came up with together, which was just so fun. So the next kind of experiment is the Queen of Sweden rose. So I don't ever show the front of my house on social media because safety. But the front of my house is not super landscaped. Like we've got a smaller live oak tree. We've got some red tips that are kind of against our fence line, but there's really not much going on in our front yard. We also have a fire hydrant and a massive sewer drain. And I feel like it would be like somewhat irresponsible to like put a bunch of landscaping everywhere, and then in the event of emergency where like the storm drain needs to be accessed or the fire hydrant needs to be accessed, I just feel like it doesn't work, you know? So we don't have a lot of landscaping in the front, but I really want something. Like, you would not roll up to the front of my house and be like, what Brooke Rose definitely lives here. You would not think that at all. And so I would love to put a potted rose. So I'm gonna experiment with a potted plant in the front of our house. And we do have a red brick house, and so I thought this really beautiful pale pink rose would be really nice. And also there's part of the year where that area is in partial shade. So this is where we're gonna do a little experiment together with a partial shade and container friendly rose with the Queen of Sweden. So the Queen of Sweden, Wide, shallow cupped blooms, petals 100 plus with a soft pink and exuding mild myrrh fragrance, are beautiful at any stage. An upright, repeat, blooming, bushy growth habit with few thorns makes a good cut flower. So that's also good that it doesn't have a bunch of thorns because it's gonna be right by our front door. And I don't want people having a thorny entrance into my house. Now this next one is a bit of an experiment, but also this one really reminded me of the Jacobite rose that we saw in Scotland, and I really connected with that older Scottish woman who was a gardener. Sarah, if you're out there, if you happen to catch this, you're the best. Can we hang out? She very explicitly told me not to get a rambler and to get a climber instead, since I live in like a normal house and not on a big property. So I got the climbing iceberg rose that we are going to, like I showed you earlier, in that spot kind of in the shade. It's actually right on the other side of this wall. I'm gonna get a trellis that bolts to the wall, and we're gonna try and grow it up there in the partial shade and see how it does. So the climbing iceberg, the continual blooming sport of this outstanding Floribunda iceberg, in the spring it's covered with clouds of pure white, semi-double blooms exuding a honey fragrance. Sounds so lovely. Doesn't this all sound lovely? Like, I just want to walk around with my coffee and admire my roses. I think I'm gonna do that. Now the last one, I wanted to do a container rose in full sun. So I'm really thinking about like apartment dwellers when I do these container roses, because holy schmoly, if I would have known that you can grow roses in pots on balconies that were like partial shade or full sun, that would have been game over, y'all. I would have had so many roses that I would have been carting around. I already had enough problem with my fruit trees that I was collecting in pots before we moved into our house that I carted. I rented a U-Haul van specifically to get all my fruit trees to this house from our rental house. So it's probably good I didn't know this, but if you live in an apartment or like like you don't live in your house and you want to take the rose with you and put it in a pot, these experiments are for you, okay? So full sun, this is the Frida Kahlo rose, and I actually also let my husband pick this one because it was fun. The striking swirl of colors in Frida Kahlo intensifies as the flowers age, adding a red flush as its final touch. The sweet flowers are set in small clusters on a healthy, disease-resistant plant with glossy foliage. So we're going to put a pot of roses somewhere out where it's very, very sunny and it gets a bunch of sun and it's really hot. And we'll kind of go through the journey of the difference of a container rose versus a rose in the ground versus partial shade versus full sun. We're gonna go through it all, fam. Thank you so much for watching this video with me today. I really hope you go on this rose journey with me. If you want to go ahead and start looking at those roses, go ahead and check out Heirloom Roses. They are a great company. They are really proud of their plants. They have a huge selection and so much knowledge. If you have questions, leave them in the comments or reach out to the Heirloom Roses folks. They're super duper smart. And don't forget, if you do want to purchase with Heirloom Roses, use the code Brooke20 for 20% off. And last but not least, you can go ahead and order now and they will ship you your roses when it's time for you to plant them. So I really hope you go on this journey with me this year into roses. I'm still gonna be doing all my other content too with veggies and all this other stuff, but the rose journey I'm really excited about this year. So thanks so much for watching. Happy gardening, and we'll see you next time. So what I did was I went on the Heirloom Roses. I went on the Heirloom, oh my God. Come on, Brooke. I went on the Heirloom Roses website,